Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, France is about to choose its political destiny in the course of the next week as of the posting of this video. Indeed, on April 24th, the French will have two choices given to them by their political system. Marine Le Pen, who is known to be a populist bomb thrower, to say the least, by many political analysts, but for many French people represents a very resounding voice against some of the cultural forces that they're fighting, and Emmanuel Macron, who are for the more centrist of the French folk, or those who are not necessarily used to a changing status quo, represents stability, represents the general policies that France has been having for a while. Now, my friends, the reason I want to talk about this election, despite being an American commentator, is because I see some very important themes transpiring within France right now, particularly manifesting within the form of Marine Le Pen, that I think have universal implications for everyone, especially all of us in the West, and especially those of us in America. And I actually wanted to focus more on Le Pen in this video, because I find her as a candidate quite fascinating. So, my friends, if you were to Google Marine Le Pen, one of the first things you would get from several news articles, far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, and you would be consistently assailed with that term far-right. Now, my friends, there's some important thing to know. Now, my friend Connor Tomlinson made a really brilliant point on this matter, that the term far right was actually meant to describe the legislative positions of people in France during the revolution who supported the monarchy and who didn't support the monarchy. And that's how he actually got these terms, and perhaps these terms are antiquated. But I would take that even a step further and say that the use of the word far right or far left in any context is particularly designed not to signify someone's intellectual position, not to signify a product of intellection, but rather to invoke disgust in the hearts and minds of those who may be on the opposing side as that person. If a left-leaning person were to hear the word, or a centrist were to hear the word far right, the word far signifies something that is beyond one's realm of experience, beyond one's ability to comprehend, beyond one's ability to interact. And as many philosophers have noted in the past, human beings tend to prefer the familiar to the distant. In fact, this was Michael Oakeshott's admonition when he described what the meaning of conservatism was. He said, conservatism is that which, amongst many other things, prefers the familiar to the unfamiliar, the close to the distant, so to speak. I'm heavily paraphrasing, but that is essentially the meaning of his words. And the use of the term far left or far right are simply downstream of that desire. Because when human beings are comfortable, when we're in our civilizational box, when we don't have to challenge ourselves, and we can simply exist within the bounds of predictability, these kind of terms provide us the same comfort that, say, consistency in other matters does. Now, the problem is, disgust can be a very good emotion. It can be something that helps us begin to form our conclusions about certain things, but it is an introduction disgust. Disgust should not be the end-all, be-all of your sentiment. If you don't like something just because it does not conform to your taste, but you don't do any of the intellectual work to determine if your tastes are pair with what is ethically correct or what is sensible, then my opinion is that your taste, being uninformed, crude, and rudimentary, have no place being spoken beyond your very narrow mind. Now, if you're willing to subject your taste to the powers of reason, to light of reason, in scrutiny, and they hold up under moral evaluation, then most certainly perhaps your tastes are good, not just because you like them, but because there's a broader understanding established by looking outside yourself. The Western man today is imprisoned by the lie of the subjective. And I know this is going off topic, but I have to talk about this. The lie of the subjective basically tells us that our lived experience, how we feel about something, constitutes what is the general sense of what is. What you feel, especially in the context of your own conditions, your own life, all of that constitutes what the world is, or rather, how the world should be seen and interacted with by your lens. It puts an ethical imperative upon people. It puts a political imperative upon people. It puts so many different imperatives upon people to respect your experience at the cost of, if they don't, erasing you from existence. This is how this idea is sold to us. Now, the use of an exploitation of tastes to make you hate your political opponents is not explicitly lived experience. That's just explicitly rhetorical wizardry. But it can fall into the same box. And so we have to be very careful because, again, ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They are ideas that are connected to other ideas. And those ideas, depending on the content of them in question, can bode not very good things for you, your life, your understanding of the world, or civilization. Back to Le Pen. So the first thing you're going to see when you Google Marine Le Pen is far right. I want you to disregard far right, far left. Do not listen to those words. They are meant to evoke a sense of disgust within you, as I mentioned before, and they're not worth hitching your understanding of a particular person's values or principles upon. What is worth hitching your understanding of a particular person's values or opinions are how they conduct themselves, particularly in terms of their values. What do they say they believe? And this is where Le Pen has generated controversy. Over the years, Marine Le Pen has said some things that have made people think that she is not someone who is going to be safe for office, that she is not someone who holds good values or good morals. I will mention some of those things right now before I get into her more concrete policy prescriptions. And I should also mention that Marine Le Pen, she is the head of a party in France formerly called the National Front, which is now called the National Rally, which is known for its emphasis on what they would call preserving French culture, fighting radical Islamism. And these are their words again. I'm not trying to puff them up. I'm not trying to saturate their image with glory. I'm just saying their words. So fighting radical Islamism, preserving French culture, which in their case means having a very limited to no immigration policy. In fact, Marine Le Pen has in the past been in favor of suspending all even legal immigration into France to preserve French culture. And we'll get into that a little bit in a moment. And I'm going to have to do like a longer video on the conversations in French society concerning cultural assimilation or the non-cultural assimilation of certain peoples. But here are some of the controversial things that Le Pen has said. So number one, she said, and this is from political.eu, she said, France is not responsible for vel de hiv. Now, I can't speak France. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. But it says here, during a 2017 presidential election on the biggest deportation of Jews from France, commenting during the 2017 presidential election on the biggest deportation of Jews from France to Germany in World War II, Le Pen said, if there are people responsible, it's those who were in power at the time. It's not France. She also added that she wanted France's children to be proud to be French again. Okay, so just in that statement, there's a few interesting things there. Number one, Le Pen is responding to the claim that the atrocities of those in France when it was under Nazi occupation cannot be applied to the French people today because the French people today were not involved in those atrocities. This argument is analogous to the American argument, the argument oftentimes advanced by conservatives that I entirely agree with, that you cannot blame white people for slavery because there were white people in the 1800s who happened to be slave owners. Any suggestion that you can is an attempt to affirm the philosophically preposterous idea of collective guilt. Guilt, my friends, can only be interacted with on an individual level. Even when you get to the business of collectives doing things, you ultimately have to pin it on individuals. Because whereas you may have a group that is responsible for a crime, there's going to be different degrees of the people in that group who are responsible for that crime. So for example, if I and a group of friends, 6 of us, go ahead and rob a bank, and all I did was simply stay in the car and drive the getaway car, am I going to be as responsible as the people who went into the bank, held a gun to the clerk's head, said, give me the money, and then scared her half to death, made her have a heart attack, take the money? Of course not. That would be absurd, wouldn't it? Because it's not proportional to what I did. Justice can only be enacted on an individual level because in reality, all ethics is interpersonal. All ethics, write that down. All ethics is interpersonal. That is not to say that ethics itself is born of individual desires or whims, but that is to say that ethics is simply exists to regulate how we interact with each other. And if all ethics is interpersonal, there has to be a basis for ethics that goes outside of our own subjective musings, our own subjective idea of what things are. Because if there's not, then number one, we cannot have a consistent basis for ethics. And then number two, we cannot have a universal idea of ethics either, right? All ethics becomes solely situational and solely context dependent. But there are some things that, regardless of the context, are right and wrong. Conceptually, conceptually, rape is always going to be wrong, regardless of the context. I don't care. I don't care if rape somehow produces a good result. The result's not what matters. The principle of the action is what matters. And this crucial distinction is what so many minds in the West can't grapple around, because they are so wrapped up in this idea that cultural relativism is what's in vogue now, and postmodernism is the lens. We need to see all ethical constructs as constructs of power meant to dominate and suppress, not meant to enlighten, or even we can't even see them outside of power. Everything's reduced to power. There's just so many warped ways of understanding society that is being bequeathed upon the West by people who fundamentally want to deconstruct and then reconstruct things in their own image. And again, if you believe in collective guilt, you're falling into that category. And Le Pen's simply just saying, don't blame me for the sins of my ancestors. Yet, she got criticized for that. Le Pen also said, and this is I don't agree with this. I don't agree with half of this statement, but I agree with the other half of it. Le Pen also said in 2017, she said to the Prime Minister of France during that time, Francois Fillon, I hope I'm saying that right, that the policy of the government you led was absolute nonsense. It brought Islamists to power in Libya, it weakened integrity of the region, and now we have radical Islamism on our soil. So what, and she also said that France was a university for jihadists. What Le Pen was saying there was that the French intervention in Libya, and for those of you who do not remember, the French intervention in Libya happened in 2011, happened on the heels of a United Nations no-fly zone. I believe it was UN Resolution 1973, which basically was an attempt by the UN to stop Muammar Gaddafi for his deeds. And then it was jump-started when Barack Obama in March, I forgot what date, 13, 14, 15, March 2011, went ahead before the nation. I remember I was watching it live. I was a little boy, I was watching it live. Went ahead and said, Muammar Gaddafi, it has to be stopped. We cannot stand idly by while a dictator says who has no mercy on his people. And after that, the entire world, including France, just lurched to the conflict. We bombed Libya for many, many months, and we essentially, after we bombed Libya, after the West bombed Libya, left Libya open for factionalism, and there was chaos. There wasn't a stable government for many, 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 many years. There's finally one now, but there is an argument that the governments in now are radical and things of that sort. And so what Le Pen was doing there, she was critiquing the internationalism of NATO, the internationalism of the UN, and how it could possibly ensnare France into a bad situation. Now, Le Pen's premise that getting involved in such conflicts are bad is wise, but her conclusion that there is not that by itself has now allowed radical Islam to penetrate France is not wise, because again, natural immigration, which is something that Le Pen is not necessarily in favor of people who come from certain areas, and there has been immigration in France for decades from North Africa, from what I understand. People tend to import their values from certain places. And that's not a problem. The problem is not people importing their values from a certain place. The problem becomes when people refuse to assimilate, and they forcibly refuse to assimilate. Now, if someone wants to maintain their cultural identity while still respecting the general values of a certain culture, fine. That should be fine, as a matter of cohesion in society. But sometimes it doesn't happen. In the United Kingdom right now, there are entire sections of the country where police will not go because there are certain people that have gone there, have refused to assimilate, and now have enacted mini Sharia law in those areas of the country. unfortunately. I might do a video about that soon as well. So there's so many reasons as to why cultural cohesion is important. Most certainly, as the founders of the United States mentioned, to have a culture that in which liberty and individualism, I'm kind of paraphrasing the individual part, is emphasized upon, you have to have some kind of shared values. You don't have to have everyone living the same way. Goodness knows that I wouldn't live half the way people in my community live. I want to live how Christian Watson wants to live, of course, follow my own North Star. But it does mean that you have to have some consistency, some basic ground upon which you can interact with other people. And of course, again, these are just some quotes. I'm going to get into her policies in a little bit. But she also said one thing. She said that there have been prayers in public spaces and it's an occupation. So she said 15 years ago, we had the veil. There were more and more veils. Then there was the burqa. There were more and more burqas. And then there were prayers on streets. Now there are 10 or 15 places where a certain number of people come regularly and take up all the space. For those who like to talk a lot about the Second World War, if it's a question of talking about occupation, that's an occupation of the territory. She's basically saying that Muslim women who pray and who wear their cultural garb, burqas or veils, and who do so in public are occupying France. So these are just a few quotes that dissect the sentiments of Marine Le Pen. From what I can tell, they are completely in context. These are all hyperlinked, and I will put the sources in the description for you. And that's concerning, because I think that view itself expresses more of a matter of disgust, taste, as I was just mentioning, as opposed to a genuine ethical concern with Muslim women peacefully praying on French streets. If she was saying that Muslims were going through France forcing other people to pray and enacting Sharia law, then I would understand her aversion. But she's simply in that quote saying that Muslim women are praying on their knees in the streets, and that's an occupation. So what is not an occupation then? What is the inverse or the reverse of that, Miss Le Pen? Is it Christians instead praying instead? Again, Le Pen's critiques tie into a presumption of a broader cultural identity that she wants to preserve, and that she calls the French image. And my friends, sometimes we're enslaved to little gods. Gods that exist in our imagination that we don't necessarily try to validate through reason or through critique, but instead exist in our passions. And this is primarily what nationalism is. And I'll get to that in a moment because that's why Le Pen's so interesting. But we have to understand that Le Pen did not come in a vacuum. There is a reason why Le Pen is so popular. While has been increasingly popular amongst the years, even amongst homosexuals. By 2017, Le Pen was actually pretty popular, even though her father called it homosexuality a biological anomaly and is completely against all of that. And Le Pen herself signed a pledge not too long ago that would basically say that would get rid of homosexual inclusion in same-sex marriage. But even then, the National Rally Front, whatever they call it, their party is full of homosexuals, and there are a growing number of homosexuals who are actively wanting to vote for Le Pen. So there is a certain sentiment that Le Pen is tapping into in French society. There is still, for example, in French society, skepticism of immigrants. And I get this from dissecting the sentiments of various French people by and way through Pew Research. And there was a Pew Research study done in 2021 that confirmed that in France, there are still 66% of French people, according to the survey, that believe being able to speak the country's dominant language is very, very important. They divide the survey between somewhat important and very important. In the same survey, they also say that 36% of people say that being able to share the country's customs and traditions is some very important, but there are also 35% of folks that say it's only somewhat important. So there is this divide in France where there are people that say, no, you have to speak the French language, you have to follow our traditions, don't change anything. Don't, in Le Pen's words, occupy anything. And Le Pen's coming in to those very significant amount of people and saying, okay, I'm your spokesperson, I'm your advocate. Now, in terms of immigration in general in France, that perspective is interesting as well, because in France, in 2014, 54% of French people said that immigrants today want to be distinct from our society. In 2018, the same number of French people said, only 44% of them said that, but 51% said that immigrants want to adopt our customs and way of life. Then in 2020, the most recent, 49% said immigrants want to adopt our customs and way of life, and 43% said they want to be distinct. Now look, here's my deal with surveys. Surveys only reflect those who are studied in them. Surveys are limited on the basis of the knowledge problem. It is impossible for any statistical graph or data to be omniscient. And I really hate it when people say 45% of Black Americans say this or 45%. No. 44 or 43% of people surveyed said that. Now, you can probably reflect through consistent data. You can probably reflect a more broader trend in society by getting numerous data points. That's fine. But my deal is I want to be sure that we are being epistemically humble in the pursuit of knowledge. So Le Pen is tapping into something. And Le Pen is also tapping into Euroscepticism. Now, even amongst people, because there are three main candidates running in this election. It's coming up. There's Emmanuel Macron, Marine Le Pen, and then Mélenchon. Mélenchon is a leftist. Mélenchon's a socialist. And even amongst Mélenchon's supporters, many of whom hate Le Pen, hate Macron. For Mélenchon's supporters, Macron is a centrist neoliberal who's bad news. For Le Pen, she is a racist, whatever nationalist who loves Putin. We'll get in that moment. And so the divide here is pretty stark. But even amongst them, there is skepticism of the European Union. And Le Pen has said several times that she wants to pull France out of that sort of sphere of the EU's influence, that she wants to negotiate the relationship between France and NATO. In fact, in 2011, she said that Russia and France have common civilizational and strategic interest, and she wants France completely out of NATO's integrated command structure. And she has recently also reiterated that goal as well. She wants France to be out of NATO's structure. And again, there's merit to this, because if the idea is that France is being taken around and against its interests around the world by these international bodies, and again, this is plain Euroscepticism as well, which is particularly applies as critique to the EU. And that is particularly happening because you do have the EU handing down diktats, which may not reflect the values of the people who they are dictating to. That's a completely valid complaint. That's a completely valid complaint that she has. Now, whether it would be healthy geopolitically for France to be out of NATO or whatever, that's not my business. What is my business, however, is seeing how these broader critiques feed into, Le Pen's thematic patterns. And her thematic patterns, again, seem to include, this sort of skepticism towards outside forces. Here's another thing. Marine Le Pen once said that her and Putin would be a part of a new world order, since her and Putin, and France and Russia rather, share civilizational goals. Now, she has also said about numerous things about Russia that are not necessarily very, very good, in my opinion. She has also said about Russia that Crimea was not at all staged, that the Russian people, or people in Crimea rather, voted for Crimea to go when it was annexed, even though that's not the case. Putin had his thugs go in. He completely fudged the voter laws to have people who were not registered, who were registered on the same day of the election go in. It was complete and utter fraud, but she said that it was not fraud. She said before the invasion of Ukraine that she did not believe that Putin would invade Ukraine. And of course he did invade Ukraine. And she has condemned him. I'll be fair. Marine Le Pen has condemned Putin. She has most certainly condemned Putin. But she's also been very skeptical, however, of sanctions on Russia. And this is where I think Le Pen has a point, because she said that she does not want to deliver heavy weapons to Ukraine because she does not want France to be a co-belligerent against Russia. And this is another point that is also very, 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 very important, because the entire genesis of the Ukraine-Russia conflict goes back many decades, but it reached closer to its zenith in 2021, when in the summer of 2021, Zelensky went ahead, visited Joe Biden, said, hey, I want to go into NATO. Biden didn't really entertain him. But then a month or so after that, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, went ahead and said, well, if Ukraine comes into NATO, Russia should not be at all threatened because NATO is a purely defensive alliance and a country has a right to defend itself. So essentially, Stoltenberg and NATO were entertaining the idea of Ukraine coming into NATO without actually committing to it. And then afterwards, the Kremlin said, not too long after that, that would be a red line for them. And NATO kept poking the bear, and NATO just didn't commit to a solid answer on the Ukraine situation. And now we have a global war which has spawned a rash of sanctions, of which are punishing people not even involved in that war. They're punishing British citizens, punishing American citizens with high gas prices, supply chain disruptions, and we're supposed to believe that these things are supposed to be benevolent. The problem is immoral tools are being used to advance the vain benevolence or the supposed vain benevolence of a bunch of people who happen to occupy certain seats of power. Because sanctions are always fundamentally immoral. When you shut down my ability to voluntarily and peacefully trade with another person, you are destroying my interpersonal relationship with them, and you are getting rid of any other case would be a perfectly morally valid transaction. When consent and voluntary nature is involved in a transaction, it is inherently moral, or at least that part of it is moral. It may not be in good taste, right? And that's a different story, of course. So Le Pen has been a little bit of a Russia apologist, though, by saying that Crimea was completely legitimate, by saying that Putin and Russia and France share civilizational goals, even though Russia has been known to go ahead and sanction in an approving way the murder of gays in Chechnya. Russia has been known to go ahead and poison its political dissidents. Le Pen simply recently expressed she expressed confidence in Russia's elections, even though she said, I'll listen here. She said, what I notice is that Vladimir Putin's government must at least please the Russians enough to be reelected regularly in the country. Even though Putin has fudged the election several times, his opponent, Alexei Navalny, he has quite literally put in legal barriers for him to be able to run, locked him up in prison, and then when his lawyers said, hey, we're going to go ahead and appeal, this is quite recently, locked his lawyers up in prison too. I mean, Putin has been doing everything in his power to reduce his opponent's ability to be effective against him. And yet Le Pen said here that he's reelected by the people. It's obvious to me, and this ties into Le Pen's broader nationalism, it's obvious to me that Le Pen has some significant, if you could even call them blind spots, I don't even want to be that generous, in which she is willing to side with tyrants and strongmen because she sees what they're doing with their strongmen power and with their tyrannic force as advancing the identity and preserving the culture of their country. And she sees a reflection of that, of what she wants to do in France, even if she wants to do it in a slightly different way. Although I would argue that, again, Le Pen certainly does also have an authoritarian streak to her as well. Le Pen wants to renationalize highways in France so she can price fix the tolls. So she wants the government to be in control of the highways in France. They are now privately held. But on the flip side, Le Pen also wants to privatize French state media. So on one hand, she wants to put the flow of information in France into hands that will not be tainted by the diktats and interests of those in power. And on the other hand, Le Pen wants to go ahead and put the highways in exactly that same predicament. Le Pen wants to get rid of welfare for immigrants. Fine. But she wants to increase social spending and welfare for single mothers and other people in France. Le Pen wants to teach French students how to be good French people by simultaneously mandating uniforms in schools. Yeah, mandating uniforms in schools and penalizing, and I'm reading this exactly from her website, penalizing students that miss school and do not conduct their education on the basis of her standards. I'll read it right here. She wants to restore the authority of the school institution by introducing a uniform in primary and middle school while sanctioning absences and incivilities. Well, what's an incivility? We know what an absence is, but what's an incivility? Is it perhaps disagreeing forcefully with what the instructor of the institution is saying? It's probably also wise to understand what lies beneath. This is the constant phrase that I use in my videos. What lies beneath? What is the principle underpinning an action? Because there's the action itself, then there's justification for the action, then there's the principle upon which justification for the action stands upon. Let me give you a quick example of this, right? So there's the action. There's the action of defending yourself, okay? That's the action. Well, actually, no. So let's say I take a gun and there's someone who's coming at me with a knife and I shoot them. Okay, that's the action of defending myself. And the justification for that action is that I have a natural right to life. And then the principle of that action says that in order for human life to be possible at all, I have to be able to preserve myself. And in order to preserve myself, and if self-preservation is the beginning of all human action, it is thus the beginning of ethical action as well. So not only is my ability to exist and live dependent on the principle of self-preservation, but also my ability to be a moral actor in the first place is dependent on my ability to be living in the first place, and that's the fundamental principle. Okay, let's apply it. Okay, the action is wanting to make school children wear uniforms while keeping them in school, like sanctioning absences. Okay, the justification there is the idea that institutions need to have authority to be stable, and then the uniforms help that authority. And then the broader idea under that is that you have to preserve French culture, and you can only do that, again, if there is this authority. You want to increase the authority of the institutions for what? So the institutions can be stronger, in her words. Okay, the problem with this is it presumes that the government owns your kids. And Le Pen seems to be okay with the idea that the government owns French children. And the government, when it benefits her particular policy aims, has carte blanche to go ahead and dictate the terms of their life and the way their parents decide to go have them educated to them. What a fundamentally morally foul admission. But this is what Le Pen believes. Again, I can keep going on. I can go on and on about Le Pen. Here's the problem with Le Pen. It's not even that she completely ignores Putin's corruption. It's not even that she thinks that voluntary action of Muslims praying in the street is occupation. It's not even that she has a little god of French identity dominating her, which I'll talk about actually right now. A little god of French identity. Okay. There is no one French identity. The French have been fighting for so many years, decades actually. There are so many divisions within French society that predate the advent of any person from North Africa or any significant Muslim immigration coming to France. There is infighting within French society. And this is why I think the idea of national identity itself is absurd, because national identity presupposes this sort of hyper unity amongst people and it fills it in with all these assumptions. Well, people may want to be unified or may want to act as if they're unified for a certain manner, but the problem is you cannot always presuppose that someone is playing nice because they are nice. Maybe someone's playing nice because they're manipulative. Maybe someone's playing nice because they have self-interest involved. There is no national identity. There are only universal principles that underlie all of humanity, which are endemic in our common humanity and bind us together. Anything else is incidental. Whether I am a Frenchman or a British person or an American, I must respect my interlocutor's right to express himself freely. I must respect my neighbor's property. I must respect the individuality of my good neighbor. I must respect their humanity. Any cultural mores that do not form around that or not flow from that are inferior. But this is the problem of nationalism. Because nationalism puts the cart before the horse. Nationalism says the nation state and the cultural mores beneath that are more emphasized than the universal principles. And that's dangerous, my friends. Because if universal principles are neglected, upon which basis does the nation state rest upon? Not a good one. And that's the problem with nationalism. Now, of course, look, there are certainly problems with Macron as well. It's going to be a very long video, so I'm almost finished, don't worry. There are problems with Macron as well. Macron quite literally said that it's going to be his personal goal to ensure that the unvaccinated in France are basically excluded from public life. No coffee shops, no stores. He said they're going to make them uncomfortable. And he said in response to that, well, if you are mad at me making a colloquialism, then, you're just being silly. But it's not a colloquialism what he's saying. What he's saying is an ethically profane statement. The idea that you're going to rip someone's life from them simply because they will not cater to what you want them to do is not something upon which a society can be built upon. It is not an ethical statement. It is fundamentally immoral, which has made many people critique Macron. Macron oversaw the yellow vest law enforcement crowd control mechanisms, many of which ended up with innocent people getting their hands blown off by TNT-infused grenades, many of which ended up with innocent people getting their eyeballs poked out with grenade launcher-launched rubber bullets. Many and to all this police brutality, what did Macron say? Well, his minister simply said, the police have not attacked any yellow vest protesters, which also was a lie as well, by the way. There's plenty of instances of that happening. I don't even support what the Yellow Vest movement turned into. It started off as a righteous attack against taxation and turned into socialism, a socialist escapade. I don't support that. But what I also don't support is a government, instead of listening to those upon whom their legitimacy is derived, they oppress and demean those upon which their legitimacy is derived. I find that quite concerning as well. And Macron has been the chief shepherd of those immoral actions in French society. So there's most certainly every reason to be against Macron. But if you're also going to be morally consistent, then Le Pen has something to answer for. Her rejection of internationalism, which wants to simply yank France around and take it at the whims of bureaucrats in Belgium and Brussels and The Hague, fine, good with that. But then to go ahead and say that Putin didn't rig Crimea, that Putin is a legitimately elected president, even though he poisons his opponents and he rigs elections against them, that Putin, Russia, and France hold civilizational goals, even though Russia is known for, and whether it be in the time of the Tsar or in the time of the Bolsheviks or the time of Putin, is known for crushing dissent, known for authoritarian measures, whereas France has been the place where several uprisings, intellectual and otherwise, of liberty have taken place, of classical liberalism. Some of the greatest classical liberal writers, like John Barbach, as I mentioned, came from France, have taken place. To say all of these things, you have to be suffering from either willful ignorance or cognitive dissonance, or both. And if the willful ignorance is not simply ignorance of a lower sort, i.e. being ignorant of particular details about a particular matter, but ignorance of a higher sort, being ignorant of that which is universally correct and good, and upon which the basis for all that is also correct and good is justified upon, the natural law, if that's the basis for your critique or for your policies, Le Pen, you can't be supported. No one with a conscience can support you. Sorry. So, and then to also say that you want French people to be proud of being France, but then to exclude Muslims who may want to assimilate but still want to pray in their own way from that category is also concerning as well. Le Pen embodies a kind of statism that is very prominent in European politics, that infuses the state with divine-like power to implement one's goals. And the reason why I think Le Pen, you don't really see many libertarian or type candidates in Europe. There's some, you don't really see them, is because Europe has a different foundational basis to it. European conservatives, for example, many of them, at least if you're in Britain, they support welfare, they support all kinds of things, they support gun control, because the basis of natural law is lost upon them. But in America, there is that foundational basis of individual natural law, and that's what makes America so special. And that is why, while me as an American analyzing a French election is just also fascinating, because I recognize the basis is different in each country. The culture is different. The culture is attuned to different things. But there's also a universal code of morality that has to be provided by, it has to be subscribed to. And unfortunately, neither Macron, Le Pen, and certainly not Mélenchon, adhere to that simple dictate. So in closing, my friends, Marine Le Pen, I forgot to mention, the little god, as I mentioned, the little god of French identity. There is no French identity because, again, there's variations and all that kind of stuff as well. But to presume that there is a French identity and then you can implement it upon other people through force means that, again, you're not going to look at the variation in man's thoughts. You're not going to look at the divisions within a particular culture. You're going to emphasize one faction in that broader division and then apply it through legislation, and therefore you're not reflecting any identity but your own, the identity of your own narrow thoughts. And that's not something that's particularly good. There's a reason why Le Pen is rising in France. There's a reason. And there are plenty of things that I have not even gotten to. The critiques of her, critiques of Macron, because I don't have the time. But I want to leave you all with this. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. There may be French people watching right now who want to vote for Le Pen because Macron is terrible. My friends, moral compromises are not justified. Because even though Macron most certainly is terrible, he has no respect for liberty, he is completely willing to oversee brutalism and authoritarianism in his own police forces. He is completely willing to oversee the economic death of the French people by and through sanctions against Russia. And Le Pen seems to be much better on some of those issues. Le Pen still has problems of her own that, on balance, fundamentally threaten the basis for good governance. And if people in France want good governance, well, that's a different topic for a different day that I don't have the answers for yet. But never compromise on your morals. Always stand on principle, even if it's politically inconvenient, because ultimately you will be happy that you did so if you have a conscience and if you are convicted enough. Think on it. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, patreon.com/PhilCWatson or PayPal officialcwatson@gmail.com, or please join me on my locals. It's going to be christianwatson.locals.com, or my Discord, which is going to be in the comment section down below. Please like, share, and subscribe to me. Like this video, share this video. This message is dynamite. It's long, but it had to be long because, again, you can't condense all of this into a very short snippet and still maintain depth. My friends, thank you so much for being on this journey with me. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.